The moment my daughter-in-law burst into tears, everyone stopped looking at her and started looking at me. Before I could say a single word, she whispered, "I never thought you would do this to me." And somehow the room decided she was telling the truth. My own son stepped between us without asking what had happened, as if the verdict had already been reached long before I walked through the front door. I watched familiar faces fill with disappointment, but what unsettled me most wasn't that they believed her. It was how prepared she seemed for that exact moment. Then I noticed something no one else appeared to see. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't surprised. She was waiting for me to defend myself, waiting for me to lose my composure, waiting for everyone to mistake silence for guilt. That was when I realized this wasn't an argument born in a single afternoon. It was the final scene of a story someone else had been writing for years. So I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply looked at Rebecca, offered the smallest smile I could manage, and took my seat as though nothing extraordinary had happened. If she believed her version of the truth would survive forever, there was no reason to interrupt it too soon. My name is Eleanor Brooks. I'm 68 years old, and by the time my family finally discovered who had truly been lying to them, they would understand that the most dangerous deception isn't the one people tell. It's the one everyone is eager to believe. I sat quietly while conversations resumed around the dining room table, but every laugh sounded rehearsed. Every sympathetic glance toward Rebecca felt strangely practiced. Daniel reached for her hand without once looking at me, and I realized something painful. He was not reacting to what had happened today. He was reacting to a version of me he had been taught to believe for a very long time. As I drove home that evening, I replayed dozens of ordinary family moments that had never seemed important before. Birthday dinners where Rebecca insisted she had forgotten to invite me. Holiday mornings when Daniel apologized because their plans had suddenly changed. Phone calls that somehow always ended with him sounding distant, polite, almost guilty for speaking to his own mother. At the time, I had blamed bad timing, busy schedules, and the ordinary complications of adulthood. Now those memories no longer stood alone. They fit together like pieces of a picture I had never wanted to see. Rebecca had never needed dramatic confrontations. She preferred quiet adjustments, tiny changes that were almost impossible to question. A canceled lunch here. A misunderstood message there. An innocent explanation that always sounded reasonable. None of it looked dangerous by itself. But after enough years, those little moments quietly built a wall between a mother and her only son, one careful brick at a time. 3 days passed before the first crack appeared, and it came from someone who had no idea she was changing everything. I was standing in the garden center choosing a small lavender plant when my neighbor Margaret waved me over with the warm smile she had worn for 20 years. We exchanged ordinary conversation until she hesitated and asked a question that caught me completely off guard. "I hope everything worked out after Rebecca asked you not to come to Daniel's office celebration last spring." I looked at her without answering because I had never been invited to any office celebration. Margaret frowned, clearly confused. She explained that Rebecca had mentioned I preferred staying home because large gatherings overwhelmed me these days. I thanked her, changed the subject, and finished paying for the plant with hands that suddenly felt much older than they had that morning. Driving home, another forgotten memory quietly surfaced. Daniel had apologized for missing lunch with me that same weekend, saying he had been tied up with work. I had believed him without hesitation. Now 2 stories that should have matched stood side by side, and they did not. I did not accuse anyone. I simply opened a notebook that evening and wrote down every detail I could remember, wondering how many more ordinary moments had been quietly rewritten without my ever noticing. I kept adding notes to that notebook every evening, never expecting the list to grow as quickly as it did. The first page held forgotten birthdays and canceled lunches. The second page held small conversations that suddenly carried a different meaning. I remembered mailing Daniel a handwritten anniversary card with a family photograph tucked inside. Weeks later, he thanked me for the card but casually mentioned there had not been any photograph. I had assumed it slipped out somewhere in the mail. Now I wondered if it had ever reached him at all. Another memory surfaced while I folded laundry. 2 years earlier, I had left Rebecca a voicemail asking whether they would be joining me for Thanksgiving dinner. She later apologized and said she never received my message. Yet Daniel had called the following day, saying he appreciated my understanding after Rebecca explained that I had decided to spend the holiday alone. I had never said those words. At the time, I blamed poor cell phone service and ordinary misunderstandings because trusting family felt easier than questioning them. Looking back, I realized the pattern was never built from dramatic lies. It survived because each story was just believable enough to dismiss. Standing alone in my quiet kitchen, I closed the notebook and understood that I was no longer collecting memories. I was collecting evidence of a truth that had been carefully hidden inside ordinary days. After that, I stopped trying to defend myself because I finally understood that explanations only gave false stories more room to grow. Instead, I paid attention. A week later, Daniel called and invited me to Sunday dinner. His voice sounded unusually cheerful, almost rehearsed, as though he expected me to accept without hesitation. I agreed immediately. When I arrived, Rebecca greeted me with the same gentle smile that had convinced so many people she could do no wrong. She hugged me lightly and asked if I wanted coffee before dinner. Everything looked warm, welcoming, perfectly ordinary. Yet something felt carefully arranged. During the meal, she casually mentioned how worried everyone had become about my memory. She laughed softly and said I had probably forgotten several conversations over the past year. Around the table, a few relatives exchanged sympathetic smiles. No one challenged her. I simply stirred my tea and nodded politely, but inside I remembered every word she had spoken. She was no longer inventing isolated misunderstandings. She was quietly building a reason for people to question my version of events before I even spoke. That realization changed everything. If she wanted everyone to believe my memories could not be trusted, then proving the truth would require more than recollection. It would require patience, careful timing, and evidence that no one could explain away. The evidence began to appear in places Rebecca never expected anyone to look. One afternoon I searched through an old storage box for tax documents and found a stack of greeting cards Daniel had mailed over the years. Tucked between them was an envelope I recognized immediately. It was the anniversary card I had sent with the family photograph inside. The photograph was still there, untouched, because the envelope had been returned to me months earlier after being delivered to the wrong address. I had never noticed the small postal sticker covering one corner. The address label had been altered by hand. The apartment number was written in different ink from my own handwriting. I stared at it for several minutes before placing it carefully inside a folder. That evening I checked my old voicemail records through my telephone provider. Most messages had expired long ago, but the billing history still showed the exact date and time of several calls I had placed to Rebecca's number. The records proved the calls had connected, even if the recordings were gone. Alone, neither discovery answered every question. Together, they formed something much stronger. For the first time, I no longer relied only on memory. Quietly, patiently, the facts themselves had started telling the story. And I had a feeling someone else would soon make the mistake that connected every missing piece. 2 weeks later, Rebecca made the mistake that changed everything without realizing it. She sent a cheerful group message inviting the entire family to Daniel's birthday dinner, adding that she hoped everyone could finally put old misunderstandings behind them. I replied with a simple yes. Nothing more. A few minutes later, my phone rang. It was my sister, Carol, laughing gently as she asked why Rebecca had thanked her for helping organize a surprise gift. Carol had never spoken to Rebecca about any gift. She forwarded me the earlier message Rebecca had accidentally sent to the wrong family group before quickly deleting it. The message read, "Please remember not to mention the conversations Eleanor forgot. Let her bring it up first." Most people never saw it because it disappeared within seconds, but Carol had taken a screenshot while opening her phone. She thought it was strange and saved it without thinking much about it. When she showed it to me, neither of us spoke for several moments. It was not dramatic. It was not emotional. It was simply impossible to explain away. Rebecca had revealed that the story everyone believed was being managed long before anyone gathered around the dinner table. I thanked Carol, placed the screenshot beside the other documents in my folder, and quietly realized I no longer needed to search for the missing piece. It had just arrived on its own. Daniel's birthday dinner arrived with all the warmth of a family tradition. The dining room was filled with familiar voices, framed photographs, and the smell of homemade food that once made every gathering feel safe. Rebecca moved effortlessly from guest to guest. smiling with the quiet confidence of someone who believed every detail was under control. I greeted everyone kindly, handed Daniel his wrapped gift, and took my usual seat without mentioning a single word about the folder resting inside my handbag. Throughout dinner, Rebecca repeated the same gentle concern she had practiced for months. She reminded everyone that I had become forgetful lately, and suggested that misunderstandings happen more often than people realized. Several relatives nodded with sympathetic expressions. Daniel lowered his eyes, looking torn between loyalty and uncertainty. I did not interrupt her. I simply listened until the conversation settled into silence. Then I reached into my handbag and placed a plain manila folder on the table beside my plate. No one knew what was inside, but the atmosphere changed immediately. Rebecca glanced at it for only a second before looking away, although the color had quietly drained from her face. I folded my hands calmly and looked around the room before speaking. Before anyone decides what to believe tonight, I said softly, I think every person here deserves to see the complete story. The room became so quiet that no one even reached for their coffee. I opened the folder slowly and removed each document one at a time, not to embarrass anyone, but because the truth deserved to be seen without anger or interruption. First came the returned anniversary card with the altered address label. I passed it to Daniel without saying another word. His eyes remained fixed on the envelope as he compared the handwriting. Next came the telephone record showing the dates and times my calls had connected, the very calls everyone believed had never happened. Finally, I placed Carol's screenshot in the center of the table. No explanation was necessary. The message spoke for itself. Daniel read it once, then again, his expression changing with every line. Around the table, relatives quietly leaned closer until the silence became heavier than any argument could have been. Rebecca tried to smile and said there had to be a misunderstanding, but the words sounded uncertain for the first time since I had known her. No one answered immediately. They were no longer looking at me with doubt. They were looking at the papers, then at Rebecca, trying to fit years of memories into a completely different picture. Daniel slowly lowered the screenshot onto the table and looked at me with eyes filled not only with regret, but with the painful realization that trust, once redirected for years, could hide the truth in plain sight.